afternoon, and thank you for being here. I think there was no better and more poignant introduction to this forthcoming discussion than the dialogue that many of you were able to follow just before we start. Europe and the Middle East, is it possible to redefine a sort of strategic cooperation in the Mediterranean? We have the privilege of having with us Paul Salem, your Vice President for International Engagements with the Middle East Institute, Ambassador Emara, former assistant to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Egypt and member of the Egyptian Council on Foreign Affairs, Zaid, Eyadat, political scientist, University of Jordan, and Constaninos Filis, who's the director of the Institute of Global Affairs and who teaches at the American College of Greece. The speed and the intensity and also the human suffering that keeps going on in that part of the Mediterranean is, of course, absolutely amazing. I was watching the wires today, and just now, the Turkish president is hammering at Israel, although they're supposed to engage into some sort of dialogue, hammering at Israel, obviously, about continuous bombing of Gaza. There are going to be trade negotiations between the European Union and the Emirates. And of course, tomorrow in Oman, the emissary of President Trump will meet with the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And that is, of course, extraordinary news that came almost out of the blue last Monday when President Trump was giving a press conference alongside with the Prime Minister of Israel, who obviously was not ready for such amazing news. So what can Europe do in such a context where obviously the US are more than ever playing a major role? What about Turkey, which with the overthrow of the Assad dynasty in Syria is obviously playing the patron to the new Syrian regime? What about Saudi Arabia? How would they give in or not to President Trump's dream of fulfilling the Abraham Accord? I believe the American president is supposed to go to the Middle East sometime next month. And of course, Europe, which for so many years has been the main financial support for Palestinians through direct help and also through UNRWA. The French president was in Cairo a couple of days ago. He said that France would recognize the state of Palestine probably next June in the framework of a UN conference with the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So, Paul Salem, where can we find some order in all these news? Is there any rationale? Is there any strategy to speak of? Or is it all haphazard? And again, the speed of change is amazing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christine. Certainly there's a lot going on, but let's unpack a few things when talking about Europe and strategic cooperation in the Middle East. One is that the relationship between the US, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, that is changing anyway, and that Europe is having to face a future where the US is not necessarily the security guarantor. Europe is thinking about its own security. Obviously, it's focused mainly on Ukraine and Russia, but we'll have to see if Europe becomes a more coherent strategic player on its own so that it can deal with some of the issues in the region. So there's one dynamic there. There are parts of North Africa, certainly, which are really more European issues that the US, Israel, Iran have not much to do with. Libya comes to mind, certainly cooperation with Morocco, issues in Tunisia and Algeria are things that the Europeans should be able to deal with, and the US certainly has not much focus there. But when we look at the Middle East itself, it is at a point where some major transformations can take place. We've seen the major negative transformations brought about by the events of October 2023, 18 months of war, devastation of Gaza, devastation of Hezbollah, great changes in Lebanon, collapse of the Assad regime and a new order there, a much greater weakening of Iran, potential beginning of negotiations or military strikes on Iran. The good scenario and the bad scenario. The good scenarios are potentially quite significant. And they do relate to what Donald Trump would like to get done and what others in the region would like to get done. One is the one you mentioned about the expansion of the Abraham Accords. That is definitely something that the Trump 1, Joe Biden, and Trump 2 want to achieve. It's important to note it's something Saudi Arabia wants to achieve for its own reasons, for its Vision 2030 and its vision of its economic future. The leverage that gives on the Israeli-Palestinian issue is that Saudi Arabia is not going to agree to normalization with Israel without some significant concession to the Palestinians. Currently, as we just heard from Gideon Levy, and if you follow Israeli politics, the current government is in no mood to discuss any concession to the Palestinians. But maybe I would differ a bit with Gideon Levy. Trump, yes, he doesn't care about human rights. He doesn't care about many things. He also doesn't care about Bibi Netanyahu. And he is the alpha male. He's the one who pushes people around. And Bibi, I would imagine, is very nervous about what Trump might do.
Another alpha male.
Yes, but Trump likes to be the only alpha male. Anyway, the brief version of that, when you look at what Trump said about Gaza, what's most significant about that, in my mind, is when Bibi went to Washington for his first visit, Gaza was in his pocket. He left, it was in Trump's pocket. The future of Gaza will be decided by Donald Trump in his negotiations, not effectively by Bibi Netanyahu.
But these negotiations so far have not led to any results.
No, they have
and
not.
In fact,
yeah.
Israel keeps bombing.
Which
so
Gideon
where's
Levy
the great deal-making?
I mean, so far it has not certainly resulted in anything. Definitely Trump would have to put serious pressure on Netanyahu to stop the war there. But I think he is awaiting his visit to Saudi Arabia and to the Emirates to understand better what the Gulf point of view is. But I do expect within a year or two, we will have an expansion of the Abraham Accords. There will be some concession to the Palestinians. How we get there, I don't know. The other big one, to conclude, is a potential deal with Iran. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's starting tomorrow, it's likely to fail in the short term, but there is a potential for a deal there. So the positive scenario for the Middle East is two major deals that transform the region in a positive way. The negative scenario is what we're living today.
So, Ambassador Emara, that negative scenario is very much was obviously discussed in Cairo a few days ago. The King of Jordan, the Egyptian president, the French president. And again, it's always the analysis that Gaza is not only suffering every day from more and more and more bombing, humanitarian aid is blocked, apparently. Again, the pressures from Washington, assuming there are any, are not producing anything. So, in your view, what came out of this Cairo summit? Is there any chance that France and maybe together with France, other European countries, although we're quite divided about the issue, as you know, in the EU, what could come out of that summit?
Thank you very much, Christine, for the question and for putting it in that way. That I think, first of all, there's a beginning of signaling that Europe and important players in Europe are ready to stop spoiling Israel beyond its own interests, its wildest dreams. Because I believe the reason we've had this 18-month plus of slaughtering in Gaza and also in the West Bank is because the big part of the world that takes very seriously human rights issues, values that are important for humanity at large, have relinquished this role to a great extent, have closed an eye, have even encouraged Israelis to continue in this endless waves of bombardment, of killing of children and women and so on. This is something that is unprecedented. And I think Europe has a duty, being also at the forefront of these events that have created the current Middle East back in the beginning of the 20th century, to play a very important role and a crucial role for reorganizing that particular part of the world in a more peaceful light. I believe, that what came out of this is, for the first time, these signaling of President Macron that France is ready to recognize the state of Palestine as of June. It's not only alone. I mean, we've had a wave of recognition by European states already, EU members. There was even recognition earlier on by a few members of the European Union. And this process is continuing, because Europe is understanding that there is a need to change course. Now, to change course in what direction? I think in the direction of, first of all, recognizing that national security of Europe constitute also the Middle East, the Arab world, is part of the national security in Europe. This notion of national security in Europe has been shattered in the few last decades. And Europe is suddenly now recognizing, after the Ukraine war, that there is something called national security, that we need to work on national security on different fronts. And one of the important fronts is the South Mediterranean, which is a neighborhood area to Europe. The second is that we need a lot of reconstruction in the Middle East, not only in Palestine, not only in physical reconstruction, but also psychological reconstruction. But in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, in Sudan, in Somalia, the region have went through years and years of weakening of the nation state, of the institutions, to a point where we have in certain countries militias that are running countries. I don't think this is a situation that is in favor of European security or European prosperity or European stability, to have an adjacent region very close by.
Yes, but it's not to Europe to try and organize or fight against those very militias. I mean, these are
at least do not contribute to a worsening of the situation, of the erosion of, as I said, institutions. We've had armies being dismantled, police systems being dismantled in many parts of the region, and obviously everybody understands that without order and rules, you cannot govern huge areas. Just to give you to put things in perspective for the audience, Egypt is as big as France and Germany together. Only Egypt. If we take Syria, Iran, Egypt, this part of the world is twice as much, even more, twice as much as the United States in terms of size. How are you going to run a region like that with no armies, with no policing, with no institutions, and with a situation, a hope that we can change things in the Middle East and we can make it more democratic, that we can make it more looking like something that would appeal more to the so-called values that you aspire to.
Yes, but Mr. Ambassador, there are some regional organizations. That should be their duty.
Well,
Unfortunately,
of course,
they don't always agree within themselves in the first place, and they're not at all playing the part that you recommend Europeans should play.
No, I'm not recommending. I'm saying, we are talking about the relations between the Middle East or the Arab world and Europe.
Yeah.
There is a part, of course, for the Europeans to play, and there is a part also on us to play, our institutions, our own backyard, and so forth. But in a situation where most of these countries are not functioning, the countries themselves that are part of these institutions, most of them are not functioning. So it is very difficult to see a situation where we can go forward without first of all, pacifying some of the conflicts, and at the core of them, the Palestinian conflict, and resolving the issue of Palestinian statehood, and then dealing also with the other issues, because without dealing with other issues, we will remain in a situation that we have seen for decades now, where this region has become a region that attracts terrorist organizations, that has militias controlling big parts of the territory of some of the countries, that is in a way absorbed instead of doing development, instead of doing a building institution in conflicts and in futile activities. And this is nothing that is attractive in terms of a future cooperation that should be part of what we had before, the Barcelona process, the different positive processes that we had in the Mediterranean, that we had between the north and south parts of this very important central part of the world.
Let me now turn to the Jordanian point of view with you, Professor Eyadat. The King of Jordan was part of the Cairo discussions. And of course, there's another dimension to the local tragedy, and that is, of course, the occupied territories. And obviously, for Jordan, it is not only an immediate geographical issue, but also an immediate human and economic issue. So how do you see any hope for some sort of a regional order being sustained by some European countries? Again, the French president seems to be very involved and wants to be very involved. Is there any positive signs there?
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And just to set up some facts, I'm not speaking on behalf of Jordan, nor I'm bringing to the table a Jordanian perspectives. I wish the
But
king...
you will talk about Jordan.
Of course, this is different. This is different. And I wish that the king has assigned me to speak on behalf of Jordan, but he did not. But I'll be speaking as a political scientist and looking at the situations in the Middle East as it is, in terms of pure rational realism, if there is still such a thing. But while also addressing that, I want to remind you and the panelists that my impression was that we're talking about Europe and the Middle East in terms of redefining strategic cooperation in the Mediterranean. And then we're delving into the very hot issues in the region, which is, of course, important, in which I see very weak, if at all, a European role. In my understanding, Europe is irrelevant to what is happening in the region, and probably now, with Trump and the new changes globally, is irrelevant to what's happening in the world. Despite the fact of the significance place of Europe and what Europe thinks of itself, but I think Europe been practicing a lot of how am I going to say it? In not a very defined strategies and policies. one of the most important policy practice by Europe in free riding, and in particular free riding in terms of security, reliance on the states, and benefiting out of that in both Europe, Russia, the globe, and particularly in the Middle East. If you look at the European contributions to the security in the region, in the Middle East in particular, in the Gulf in particular, and compare it to the benefits you're getting out of that, you can simply read the free riding strategy and mindset in there. I think this has been practiced in different stages in different places as well. And also I can say that Europe itself is facing maybe the same set of challenges, maybe to varying degrees, that the Middle East is facing. Security challenges now is obvious, economic difficulties, and absolutely identity politics. And that has driven the whole Europe into a lot of observers, political scientists, thinking of the coming crisis in Europe. And we're not talking about, the Trump administration's approach to the globe and to Europe as a partner and to NATO, but this has been the discussion for the last few years about what is Europe's role in the world and what is the future of Europe, looking into Europe itself. Now, bringing that to the Mediterranean and looking to the southern borders and southern neighborhood, the existing frameworks that govern the relation between Europe as entity and the Mediterranean and the Middle East is non-functional at all. Since all existing frameworks are not working. And that's why the dominant trend is this bilateral relations between certain European countries and certain countries in the region, and it's a cherry picking based on the situation.
So
let me just finish this idea.
Sorry to interrupt. You mean there is no EU money per se being sustaining many civilian organizations in the Middle East?
Every single framework is dysfunctional by de facto and by default. There have been 3 or 4 different frameworks to how we perceive the southern neighborhood. We're talking almost about 3 important things. The emerging security threats that are associated with radicalization, with immigration, and with this new health environment-related security issues. And then with emerging strategic priorities. But aside from emerging issues and urgencies in Europe to deal with these things, there is no strategic vision of what a southern neighborhood's policies, European policy, should be. And that's why you see. So what role can Europe play, for example, in bringing an end to the conflict in Gaza, to the war in Gaza? We're all waiting for Trump to decide what has to be done.
Yeah, but that's not new.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying, if we want to talk about Europe and the Middle East, we have to reimagine and redefine the Mediterranean as being the interface between the two places, a shared horizon, and the security and the interest cross that border interface between the two continents is not only historical, but they are strategic these days. And
but it's also, if I may, it's also because, regimes in that part of the world would turn to Washington, D.C. more so than they would turn to Brussels, for all sorts of obvious reasons.
Yeah, to whom? To Brussels? What do you want to Brussels? What Brussels can do to anyone?
Well, money.
Well, that's the free rider one more time. People, players, they decide and they calculate where their interests are and who can do what and who cannot. And obviously, Washington can do much more than Brussels, and that's the relation, and I think it will continue that way. If Europe to stay as we knew it, I don't know what's going to happen to Europe.
Constaninos Filis, as a fellow...
You don't like my comments. It's okay.
Sorry? Sorry, I missed that. What did you say?
I say you did not like my comments.
Oh, no, I fully... I'm extremely interested in the first place. That would be my duty in any case, even if I were not interested. But no, you have a very harsh analysis, but I guess it's only fair to say that indeed there's no common strategy. But as you know, certainly, foreign policy is not a common domain that is shared by the 27 European members. And so it is true that bilateral relations have always played a larger part, plus very specific economic interests in some cases. So, Constantinos, come to my help, please, to say that we Europeans...
Although I agree with all the comments of the previous speaker.
Still help her, please.
We'll try.
That's a good help.
So, but of course, Greek, for all sorts of obvious reasons, has been and still is particularly concerned with all aspects, either on defense, on migration, energy, all sorts of issues. How do you view the strengthening role of Turkey as a patron, in particular, of the new Syrian regime? Does that mean, from your point of view, a new balance or disbalance of power?
Well, if I may, before I answer your question, I would like to share some views regarding the external influences that affect the Middle East, and then I will turn into Turkey. We have a new sheriff in town, as Vice President Vance said about President Trump. However, the problems in the Middle East, some of them are old, some of them are new, but it seems that they are either unsolvable or difficult to deal with. And it is true that the Americans had or still have less interest on the Middle East because they're not anymore energy dependent as they used to be, thanks to the shale oil and shale gas revolution. And it also seems to me that this created a void that no other power, including the European Union, could fill in. Also, China made some attempts in previous years. We had this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there was a mediation, a mediation role for Beijing, but they lack substance when it comes to the Middle East, and it doesn't seem to me that they want to be involved heavily in the Middle East. Russia has, of course, its own interests and acts in some cases more as a spoiler rather than a constructive power. But look how Ukraine affects the Middle East in the sense that President Trump seems willing and determined to bring Russia closer to the US because he wants to contain or deter China. And in this discussion between Washington and Moscow, the Middle East is part of this discussion, especially Iran and recent developments, given the strategic retreat, the strategic setback that Iran suffers since October 7th, 2023. Let me turn to Turkey and say that, of course, Turkey nowadays is, the plan on behalf of Turkey when the Arab uprisings started back in 2011 was to have control over governments starting from Libya or even Tunisia up to Syria. They succeeded in a way in Libya. Of course, Libya is divided, but still they sign a memorandum delimiting maritime zones with the government in Tripoli, which of course we consider as null and void. They also they were lucky only for 1 year in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, but now that is not the case, although Egypt is a very interesting case both for Greece and for the European Union, but we don't have time to speak about Egypt per se. And in the case of Syria, the Turks invested in overthrowing Assad. They did not succeed for almost 12, 13 years, but the jihadists succeeded in overthrowing Assad only in 13 days. And that, of course, created a new reality in the Middle East. I would say that it is Israel which is more concerned about the fact that, as it happened with Iran through its proxies, they didn't share physical borders, but Iran was present through Hezbollah, through Hamas, in the borders of Israel. Now it seems that Turkey is present through the new regime in Syria. We are concerned, as well as Cyprus is, given that Turkey, as said before, signed a null and void agreement with the government in Tripoli, delimiting maritime zones. So we are concerned that they might attempt to repeat that with the new government in Syria, but still we have something at our disposal, some instruments, which is recognition, international recognition. So if the new regime wants money to flow in the Syrian economy, otherwise it will not survive, then it needs international recognition. And this international recognition passes through the European Union.
Well, organizers should always plan for a triple length of time when it comes to discussing the Middle East. We only have 3 minutes left. So starting with my new Jordanian friend, in just a few words, what would be the best measure Europeans could take regarding that part of the world? Just in a few words from the four of you, starting with you, sir.
With me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You're here, Jordanian.
A few words.
Very few words. Well, I think it's changing mindset of how we perceive the others, and basing our perceptions of the others on old historical narratives. I think it's outdated, and the Mediterranean is a major and integral part of Europe's security and existence, and the Middle East is a full partner into that.
Mr. Ambassador, your turn.
I think it's more realism in terms of dealing with the majority population in that part of the world, which is the Arab world. This is the population that matters for the future. Of course, we have important players like Turkey, like Iran, and so forth, but they do not constitute the core of this neighborhood that is very close to Europe. And that is a very, very important change in terms of mindset. Because I don't think that we can go forward ignoring these 400 million people that are on your borders, that are also the gateway through which people from Africa move to Europe, vice versa. This is an area that could be an area of prosperity, of co-production, of industrialization in the South that is beneficial for you and beneficial for us.
So, Paul Salem?
Yeah, I would think on the strategic sense, I mean, there's really two potential change agents in the region. One is a major deal with Iran, and one is a breakthrough for the Palestinians with leverage because of the Saudi potential deal and normalization. If those two things happen in the next 2 years, it will be a very different Middle East and a much better Middle East. It is the case that the US is the main player, but Europe is all over the Iran issue, Europe is all over the Palestinian issue, Europe has good relations in the Gulf. So whatever it can play to help those two big things have a chance to occur, that will be transformative. In the meantime, the Trump administration has cut all humanitarian aid, all democracy aid, all of that. That is maybe less strategic, but it's more humanitarian to provide that support for refugees, displaced people, pro-democracy, civil society, that the Trump administration has cruelly abandoned.
And abandoned the tool of influence for his own country, which is part of the bewilderment that has seized upon many of us. The last word in Greek.
In Greek?
Well, yes. So we're in Delphi. I mean, that's the place, to have a last omen.
Yeah, the omens are not so positive. If I'm going to speak in Greek, the rest, unless they already know Greek or they want to exercise their Greek, they can't understand me, so I have to speak in English in 10 seconds, okay? We certainly need a new narrative and also new instruments because you cannot solve all problems with old instruments. And we also need, as said by the ambassador, the psychological reconstruction, which I liked. Give me 1 second. And we certainly need a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, apart from the psychological reconstruction. The motto for the current US president is business and peace. If we want to
So we should do peace and business.
First, we need stability, and then we need business.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed to the four of you.
Thank you, Christine.